Hi there, Alex here at mixinglessons.com. In this video, we're going to talk about a situation that you might sometimes find yourself in, where you have a mix which sounds muddy, but at the same time it sounds harsh or maybe brittle. This is a situation I find people quite often find themselves in, particularly when they're first learning about EQing a mix. And what happens is you start with a muddy mix, and the steps that you take to try and resolve that result in a mix which is still unfortunately muddy, but you've created another problem and you've got a mix which is also now sounding harsh or thin or brittle. And so in this video, we'll have a look at how that comes about and an approach that you can take to make sure that that doesn't happen. So if you are finding that sometimes your mixes are both muddy and harsh, then this will show you how to resolve that. When you're working with instruments like drums, electric guitars, maybe if you also had acoustic guitars, pianos, vocals, and reverb channels, tracks like this are all going to add low-mid information into your mix. You're going to have quite a lot going on around the 200 to 500 hertz area of your mix, and that can build up and that can result in a mix that sounds muddy. So let's just have a quick listen to this. If you listen particularly to the way that the bass guitar and the guitars are interacting in the lower end of the mix, there's a lack of clarity there. It's difficult to pick apart what is the guitar and what is the bass guitar. We'll have another listen. So I would say that this mix sounds a bit muddy, and obviously there's not a lot going on in this mix. If you think about what would happen if you also had multiple other guitars and vocals and things like that, all of that low-mid information is going to start to build up. So where do you go from here? Well, what a lot of people will do is they'll listen to something that sounds muddy or unclear, and they'll add frequencies higher up the frequency spectrum. So let's have a look at what would happen if we did that with one of the guitars. So that certainly makes it sound brighter, and therefore perhaps it sounds a little bit clearer. And what a lot of people will do is when they are faced with a muddy mix, they'll start to do this across all of the tracks. They'll start adding frequencies higher up the frequency spectrum. So let's do that across these two electric guitars, and we'll also do it to the overheads and see how that sounds. I'll take that out of solo. Once again, we'll just boost the high end here with a shelf, and we'll do the same on the overheads. And I'm not being particularly specific about what frequencies I'm using, I'm just adding some high end. So let's have a quick listen. Well, that's certainly brighter, and that perhaps gives us the impression that it's therefore clearer. But rather than listening to that high end that we've just added, let's focus in again on the way the lower end of the bass guitar and the guitars are interacting. It's still quite unclear. That muddiness is still there. And in fact, if we bypass the EQ changes that we've made, we'll hear that the mix is still muddy in that low-mid region. So I'll start the mix playing, and then I'll come down here and I'll bypass all of the processing. So when you take away that high end that we'd added, that is giving us the impression of an increase in clarity, you can hear that the mix is still just as muddy. We haven't actually taken that muddiness away. So we've now got a track which is still muddy, but it's also now moving towards being too bright. And again, I'm just working with a few tracks here. If you expanded this across multiple tracks and you were turning the higher frequencies up across multiple guitars and acoustic guitars and pianos and vocals to try and counteract the build-up of the low mids and that muddiness, then your mix is going to move towards sounding harsh. You're going to get harshness around that 2 to 5K area, and then the frequencies above that are going to start to sound brittle and thin. And so you end up with this unbalanced mix. And this is how you will often get to a point where you've got a track which is both muddy and harsh at the same time. So now, rather than boosting higher up, let's experiment with taking away some of the low-mid information, and let's have a look at what happens if we try and resolve this muddiness that way instead. So we'll reset these filters. So now our EQs are back to the point that they started at. With this first electric guitar, let's use a high-pass filter, or you may also hear that referred to as a low-cut filter. And what this does is it gives us the impression that it actually cuts away the low end, and it only lets the higher frequencies to pass through. So let's switch this on, and I'm going to move up to, I don't know, somewhere maybe around 500. So what this means is that everything below here is going to be cut, and anything above this point is going to be allowed to pass through. That can be really useful with things like electric guitars, because although it's the low mids, as I say, maybe around 200 to 500 hertz, that I want to attenuate or to turn down, I actually probably don't want to keep anything that's going on below that 200 hertz mark either for this electric guitar. So a high-pass filter can be really useful. And by the way, if you're not so used to using plugins that look like this when you're doing EQ, if in your DAW you're a bit more used to using an EQ plugin that looks something more like this, if you're a little bit more used to an EQ where you can draw things in this way and you can actually see the effect that that's having on the frequency response, then a high-pass filter would be one of these. So the frequencies below this point are being attenuated, they're being turned down, and then anything above that point is being allowed to pass through. So we'll switch this off because we don't want to be able to hear this. I'm just showing you that so that you know which filter I'm referring to if you're a little bit more used to that kind of layout on an EQ plugin. Okay, for this next guitar, let's have a look at using a low shelf. So here, let's set this at 400 and we'll turn this down. This is a shelf here on this plugin, and again, if you're a little bit used to that other style of EQ plugin, then that would be one of these. So it turns the frequencies down over what's known as a transition band, and then that remains constant all the way down to the bottom end of the frequency spectrum. And then with this bass guitar, let's use a parametric filter. Let's set this at, say, 500 and turn that down. And once again, a parametric filter would be one of these where you can turn things down over this sort of bell shape. So we've dialed in some very rough settings there. Obviously, I'm not being particularly intentional about any of the specific frequencies that I'm setting those at or which filters I'm using and exactly why. I'm just doing this to demonstrate what would happen if we, in general, take away some of this low-mid information rather than boosting the high end. So let's have a listen to what this would sound like. So for me there, listening to that, we have reduced that muddiness in the low mids. And if you focus particularly on listening to the bass guitar, what I'm noticing is that the bass guitar is a lot clearer now. There's a lot more definition in what the bass guitar is doing. It's not masked by what's going on in the lower end of the electric guitars. And so we'll have another listen. I'll bypass everything so that it goes back to the more muddy version, and then I'll take the bypass away and we'll be able to hear the EQ again. And you should hear that low mid and low end information to some extent cleans up, and you are able to hear the bass guitar a little bit more clearly. So yeah, to me there, when you listen to the mix with the EQs bypassed, the mix is a lot more muddy. There's a lack of separation or a lack of clarity or definition between the bass guitar and the electric guitars. And then when you bring the EQ in and you listen to the combination of the high pass filter, the shelf filter and the parametric filter, which are focusing on turning down some of that low mid information and a little bit of the low end as well, we reduce that muddiness and we get some clarity and some definition in that low mid area, which stops the mix sounding muddy. And we've done so without adding or boosting anything higher up the frequency spectrum. And so we haven't created a situation where we are adding too much higher up the frequency spectrum and making things sound harsh or brittle or glassy or thin or any of the other negative terms that we might associate with too much high-end or high-mid information in a mix. Now, if you are getting to grips with applying EQ in your mix and you want to get a bit of a head start and you want to know which frequencies should I be focusing on to create different characters or different results in different instruments, then I've got a free guide which I think you'll find really useful. It's an EQ cheat sheet and it shows you which frequencies to focus on for things like vocals, electric guitar, acoustic guitar, bass guitar, and drums. That comes bundled with a compression cheat sheet and a vocal recording guide as well, and you can get all three of those completely free when you head over to mixinglessons.com/free-downloads. I'm also going to leave a link on screen to a playlist which goes a little bit more in depth on each of the different filters that we've talked about in this video. So it'll walk you through high shelves and low shelves, high pass filters and low pass filters, and parametric filters. So hope you found this video useful. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.